Welcome to Unit 4, the Middle Ages. We're now looking at the earliest portion of the history that we'll be studying, and the artwork that we'll be looking at primarily here will be in what is now the British Isles. So a couple of things to be aware of. We're now talking about the time period after the fall of Rome, roughly around 450 CE, and this unit will extend all the way up for another 1,000 years up to around the year 1400, the start of the Renaissance. So some things that are happening in Europe in general as the western half of the Roman Empire begins to disintegrate. Part of that is fueled by the migration of a multitude of different peoples, primarily the Germanic tribes moving into Western Europe and threatening the borders of the Roman Empire and kind of whittling away at it until the eventual sack of Rome. So the Germanic tribes kind of occupied the majority of Western Europe. It is at this point less heavily populated than it is now, of course, and people are living in isolated rural communities that require a fair amount of land use to sustain a relatively small population. So rather than establishing large city-states and city centers that we saw happening in the Greek and in the Roman era, we now have areas that are formed rather larger communities, larger territories with fewer people under the control of what become known eventually as kings, but begin as chieftains. And so you can kind of see Western Europe being parceled up somewhat into these smaller communities in terms of population. And you can imagine then that there are fewer hard-lined borders between nations than what we're accustomed to today, certainly. This is definitely true as we move into the British Isles as well. Definitely we have the advent of the influence of these Germanic tribes, but we also have a period during which the people known as the Angles and the Saxons begin to infiltrate or invade and establish their own culture on the British Isles themselves. So we'll be looking at a lot of different types of artwork today. First, from the Germanic tribes, we'll look also at the work of the Vikings as well as the Hiberno Saxons. So some areas to be aware of within what are now the British Isles. The island of Iona will be important for us today. This is technically in Scotland, but it's actually an island that was founded by Irish monks, and they also will found monasteries here on the island of Lindisfarne. So these are two areas that will be pretty important for us today, as well as the location of a burial site here in what is called East Anglia, northwest of London. The location is called Sutton Hoo, and we'll see a pretty remarkable find of ancient artifacts from this location. So this map again shows you the contrast between the extent of the Roman Empire at its absolute height under emperors Hadrian and Trajan, and then how that begins to fall apart as these various tribes begin to infiltrate and take over this territory. So a lot of the land mass that we're looking at today is falling under the influence of Germanic tribes and Celtic tribes. The Germanic invasions you can see here in this map really do play a major part in understanding how the art of the Middle Ages comes about and why it looks so different. We are definitely looking at territory that had been under Roman control, but not an art-making center like the city of Rome itself or even the peninsula of Italy itself. We're looking also at people who had been very tribal, who had been somewhat scattered. So objects that are handmade, objects that are portable are a little bit more prevalent during what we know as the migration period, or the period of Germanic tribal migration. The Anglo-Saxon period is really going to be about the year 450, right up until the Norman conquest in 1066. Normandy is the coast of France, which actually had been settled by the Vikings, and in 1066, the Duke of Normandy, in a dispute over the territory with the English king, launches an invasion and establishes himself on the throne. So you can see there's a lot of intermixing of peoples and a lot of influences from different cultures happening as we move into the Middle Ages. The art of the Hiberno-Saxon period comes to us essentially from this combination of these Anglo-Saxon cultures as they invade the British Isles. We sometimes refer to it as insular art. The word insula is the Latin word for island, so the art of the island becomes very different. So our beginning period here is the look at the work of the migration period on the mainland. This is found in what is today France, what the Romans would have considered Gaul, and this is fairly typical of the Merovingian culture. As that tribe makes its way across and into Roman territory, the objects that we have left behind tend to be personal objects, very fine jewelry. These objects are definitely symbols of status, and they show the intricate design work that is very typical of the Middle Ages. We often see what are called fibulae. The fibulae are definitely objects that would denote status, and the more richly decorated they are, the more your place in society would be assured. There are an enormous number of different skills being used here. Filigree, this infill of this intricate wire work, is the filigree that you see all throughout, and the inlay of these different precious stones is also pretty typical of migration period work. This example comes to us from Denmark. You can see that symmetry is pretty prevalent throughout the migration era work. You sometimes will see very abstracted but recognizable animal forms. You can see an eye, a nose, ears, and either the open mouth or the tongue of some dragon-type form, perhaps a wolf. You definitely have to look a little bit more closely to pick apart what seem at first to be abstract patterns to be able to see animal forms within. As we move to East Anglia, northwest of London, the discovery in the 20th century of a burial site really was a kind of remarkable find to help us understand the artwork of the insular cultures, the island art. This is a gold buckle that probably would have held together a leather belt, which is disintegrated over time, that was found at the Sutton Hoo burial site, where an East Anglian king was buried in a ship. And we in fact even have a helmet that was buried next to the body. So this is probably meant to be both protection for him, but also to serve somewhat as a portrait. It's somewhat reminiscent of some of the mask work that we saw in the funerary examples from the Mycenaean culture. But even more finely wrought than the migration period work that we've seen up to this point are these clasps that would have probably held together armor or attached cloaks to armor, we're not sure, at the shoulder. And these works are really incredibly delicate and intricate. The clasp here from the Sutton Hoo ship burial has what we call interlacing. You'll see this pretty prominently throughout the art of the British Isles. You can see how these lines seem to go over under to create these kind of knotted patterns. And you can also see the emphasis on symmetry and geometry. You can see in this area that there are jewels that are inlaid here that are essentially transparent. So you're seeing partially in the red area, you're seeing some patterning from the gold that is behind them. So there's a really amazing amount of skill and craft in these objects. Probably the most famous of the Sutton Hoo objects, and one to know for the test, is the purse cover. This one has all of the medieval Anglo-Saxon style that we could hope for. It has the interlaced knotting. It also has very abstracted animal forms. You can see on the left and on the right, there seem to be figures that are perhaps warriors or human figures that seem to be attacked by some sort of wolf-like creatures in a very symmetrical design. And there are a pair of birds. One seems to be a little bit larger and more aggressive, this curved beak figure with its talons here on the back of a figure that looks a little more docile, maybe a little more duck-like in terms of the beak at any rate. We can certainly see that this would be a status symbol that's very closely related to the clasp that we saw. You can see some of the patterning happening again here in the border. That sort of emphasis on geometry and those stepped edges, you see that there as well. So the object is called a purse cover because it would have held as a clasp, probably over a leather bag that contained most likely coins. The techniques of the artists of the Hiberno-Saxon period include cloisonne. So cloisonne is kind of a difficult one to understand. It is essentially an enamel, a liquid glass or silicate that's painted in between raised walls of metal and then heated, and it fuses and becomes hard and shiny. And you can kind of see that happening here. You can see the artisan has applied raised edges, so there are higher areas and lower areas that are then infilled, essentially almost by painting a liquid silicate. Then when this is heated, it becomes fused to the metal. It fills in that area. So anywhere that you see metal showing through here that looks kind of brassy, or in this more finely wrought example that appears silver, the blue in between the silver is our cloisonne enamel. Also found at Sutton Hoo is the example of these rather remarkable engraved spoons. The spoons and bowls certainly give us the idea that Christianity had found its way through the Roman Empire into the British Isles. The spoons themselves are in fact inscribed with the words Paulus and Saulus, which would be the name for Paul. Paul's name prior to his conversion on the Damascus Road was Saul. So we definitely see between the inscriptions here and the cross shapes in the bowls, we certainly can see some of the early Christian influence in Hiberno-Saxon art. Some vocab terms we need for the entire unit, definitely important ones for us here. We're starting with illuminated manuscripts. These are not lit up, they are illuminated, meaning illustrated. So books at this period had to be created entirely by hand. There was no printing press. So generally speaking, the majority of people in the Middle Ages were unable to read. The people who could read primarily were those involved in the work of the church. The monks and nuns worked in rooms within their monasteries and abbeys called Scriptoria. The Scriptoria is a writing studio. It's essentially being recreated for you here in this clip from a movie, but the idea is that the monks and nuns working in these situations would copy by hand probably no more than 5 to 7 pages a day, and these pages could be quite large. They could be about 2 feet in height. They are copied by hand very, very carefully in order to reproduce liturgical works. And the monks and nuns would also decorate these, and those decorations were sometimes copied from book to book and sometimes were the original work of an individual illustrator. So a single scriptoria, a single place for writing, would be a scriptorium. They are in plural referred to as the scriptoria, multiple. We're working on usually vellum, which is treated calf skin, so the hide of young calves would have to be obtained. So some of the larger books required the sacrifice of multiple animals to be able to obtain skins to turn it into the vellum on which the words are written. The folio is the term for a single page of the manuscript, of an illustrated manuscript. And we want to be aware of 2 sides. Recto is the front side of the page, and the verso is the backside. So you'll notice that the manuscript illustrations will often tell you which folio, which page, and whether you're looking at the front or the back of the page. Different types of books were created in the Scriptoria. The most common that you'll see in this course are the gospel books. Gospel would be a book that contains the 4 gospels. And there may be other materials there as well. There could be a guide for reading, there could be a summary section at the end, there could be editions of maps or other materials, but essentially a gospel book will contain the 4 gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. A lectionary is a book that contains passages from the Gospels arranged in a different order, arranged in the order that the priest would be presenting them at different masses throughout a calendar year, so different lessons for different times of year. So a lectionary is really for the use of those who are leading the Mass. The breviary would be a text that's more personal. It's a book that would show a monk or a nun what the prayers should be for each day. They're sort of a daily meditation book, so a more personal book. There are, of course, plenty of others. The Psalters, you'll see a handful of these in this unit. The Psalters contain the Psalms of King David. The Sacramentaries contain prayers that the priests would say during Masses. There are also benedictionals, which contain the blessings of popes. The books of hours are really books for non-churchgoers. They would tell you specific types of prayers to say at different times of day, different times of year. And the passionals are books that detail the stories of the lives of saints. So this comes to us from one of the first, most elaborately illustrated of the gospel books. This was produced in a monastery in Darrow. This is this opening section of the Gospel of Matthew. So on the left, you have the Man of Matthew, the title of the page, and then the page that announces the beginning of Matthew's account of the life of Christ, known as the Chi Rho Iota page. This is the Chi, the Rho, and the Iota. We'll see those symbols which make up Christ's initials on several pages of Gospel books going forward. So I just wanted to call your attention to it there. You can see here that the style of illustration in the Illuminated Manuscripts, this is, of course, very much part of the Christian tradition, but specifically the Irish influence. Ireland was called Hibernia by the Romans, so we're seeing kind of a fusion of Irish style and the styles of the invading Angles and Saxons being mixed together here in what becomes insular or island style. So very symmetrical. You can see that the figure is presented pretty much frontally, although it is a composite view. His legs are turned to the side. The arms are barely indicated, really, and the emphasis is much more on pattern and decoration than on specific individual facial expression or recognizable individual features. The other initial pages that show us the starts of the different books show us the figures that are associated with the 4 evangels. So Matthew's symbol is a man. These come to us from a variety of different texts, but the book of Ecclesiastes will show the vision that created this use of these symbols going forward. The ox is the symbol that's associated with the gospel according to Luke. The lion is the symbol that's associated with John. And there's the lion in greater detail. You can see, of course, that it's not based on direct observation, really, but more on a kind of interpretive, symbolic style. And then we also have Mark, who is represented by the eagle. So you can see that what happens in the copying of these books is that the first letter is usually more heavily ornamented than any other area. The words are written out by hand in ink. And then these books themselves are often translated or copied again. So you sometimes see later editions. You can see some small text that's been added to help in later translations. Probably the single most famous and most incredible of the works of this period of the Hiberno-Saxon come to us from the monasteries in Lindisfarne. So this is the cross inscribed page of what is normally called a carpet page, or a section that is part of a folio that would really not have text associated with it, but primarily be illustrative. So this cross is one of the most famous of the pages from the Lindisfarne Gospel. This is Folio 26, verso, the back side of that page, so it would be the first page in a new section. If you were to open the text, it would essentially be the section on the left as you're facing text on the right. So this piece we know a fair amount about. The Lindisfarne Gospel, which of course contains the books of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, was produced in Latin, probably written by the bishop himself, by Bishop Edfrith. The book then was bound together under the auspices of Bishop Aelfwald, and the cover itself, which is enormously elaborate, would have been enormously elaborate with gold and jewels, was made by an anchorite. An anchorite is someone who has withdrawn from earthly life and isn't exactly a monk, but is living a life of prayer within a monastery, and the anchorite's name is Bilfrith. So essentially the work is combined. It is primarily the script writing of Edfrith, the illustrations of monks under his rule, and then of course the completion of the book under another bishop and another craftsman. We also know a lot about the book because it is combined with its translations by Provost Aldred. And Aldred not only provided information about the history of the book and who made it and who made which parts, but also translated the text itself into Old English. So this is our first English translation of the books of the Gospels. So that's kind of important to think about, that the majority of the texts that are available are in Latin, and so now that people have access to them in their own language, it's going to change a bit of the relationship between people and the text itself. I just wanted you to have a good glimpse, though, at the intricacy of this incredible carpet page. The closer you get, you can see that there are actually more of those hidden animal forms that we looked at, these figures that look like really long-necked, extended birds. And if you trace the figures back, you can see that they do seem to interlace. These seem to be the legs of those creatures. You can certainly see that the knotting technique is incredibly important in this design work. This is the page that introduces Matthew, the man, or angelic form, again, that male symbol that indicates the presence of Matthew. We can see here that, again, the presentation of the body is very different from what we do in Roman style, or even in the Byzantine. We see less and less emphasis on the accuracy of the anatomy underneath the robes, and less believability of the robes across the body. The odd angles of the knees and shins and placement of the feet here has very little to do with observed anatomy, but the emphasis again is really placed on recognizing the symbolic images. So associating the apostle, the evangelist, with the evangelical symbol that represents that person is more important than making something looks anatomically perfect. Certainly that's the case here. This is a pretty remarkable text as well. This is an illuminated manuscript known as the Book of Kells. And the Book of Kells itself is one of the larger of the books. It's not the largest, but there's at least one estimate that nearly 200 calves were skinned to create the vellum to give us the pages of this book. The book itself, of course, includes the four Gospels. Although the Gospel of John is not complete, there's also a section at the beginning known as the preliminaries that does have additional information as well. been intensely studied by art historians, of course, in Ireland. One of the most important discoveries or analyses has rendered the idea that works within the book are the works of three primary illustrators. There may be as many as 4 different scribes copying the text, but we can break down some of the styles to the hand of 3 primary artists. And so the artists have been nicknamed. We don't know their actual names. The 3 primary illustrators are known as the Goldsmith, the Illustrator, and the Portrait Painter. And this image, which is the Virgin Mary holding the Christ child, who looks very much like a little tiny adult, this is the work of the Portrait Painter. This is another page from the Book of Kells, and I've tried to arrange them essentially in, I'm not showing you every single page, but in the order that they would have been seen if you were to start at the beginning and work your way through the text. This shows you the 4 evangelists, so it gives you, again, those symbolic representations of the people to whom these books were delivered. So they're the authors of, but of course the spiritual belief is that the Word of God was given to them. But essentially, the evangelists tell us the story of the life of Jesus. You have at the top that sort of angelic figure of the man. Again, that's always Matthew. The lion figure represents Mark. The eagle represents John. And the ox represents Luke. So this is the incept page, the beginning of the Gospel of Matthew. So again, there is the male figure to represent that idea. And I just wanted you to see a comparison between how this section of the book begins here in the Book of Kells compared back to the Lindisfarne Gospels. And you can see that in the Lindisfarne book, the same initial letters are used. This spells L-I-B-E-R. You can see that here, L-I. This is the B. The E wraps around the R here inside the circular section of the B. This is the word liber, or book. And so you can see also that he's holding his gospel book as well. And there's even text hidden throughout this decorative section here. These are books that would not be easily read, and they're definitely not meant for handing to any literate person. They're almost coded in these symbols and intricate combinations of the letters, so that really it is a book that speaks people who are initiated into this belief system. So the more intricate that the imagery can be in terms of the combination of the text into the pattern, the more it requires someone who is already of the faith to be able to really interpret what you're seeing. Certainly the Lindisfarne book is, in comparison, somewhat easier to read than the Book of Kells. This is one of the most beautiful of the pages. This is Folio 33, the recto, the front page. This would have been on the right-hand side, kind of closing a section. This is by most likely the same artist as the artist who made the most famous page of the entire Book of Kells, the Cairo Iota page, which we'll look at in a moment. This is an artist who has been nicknamed the Goldsmith, and you can kind of see why when we get closer to it and look at an intricate section of the book. It really mimics the kind of metalwork that we saw in the Sutton Hoo purse cover and the gold belt buckle in particular. So it's not so much just that there is gold leaf used in the decoration of the page, but also this intricate interlacing is very identifiable. So this artist is also responsible for this page, which is probably the single most talked about, well-known, iconic image from the Book of Kells. This is the Cairo Iota, which looks to us in English like an X, P, and an I. These are essentially the initials that begin the spelling of the name Christ, but in the Greek alphabet. So we've seen Greek letters used before in the images that we saw in the Byzantine Empire, particularly the image of Christ Pantocrator, Christ as the creator, we saw a lot of those began with the letter X to the left of Christ's face. So we now see that this really is spelled out in a textual way, but you have to really hunt for the letters. There's your X. The P kind of wraps the I. So you definitely have to understand what you're looking at before you're able to decode it, before you're able to read it. And the thing that is so remarkable, I think, about this object is that it allows the monk to, yes, make a copy of this text, to be able to study it, to pass that information along so that other people could copy it as well. So it helps to distribute the knowledge of biblical texts throughout the medieval world. There is some sense of these books as being not just sacred texts for the purposes of the monks who made them, but of them being important to other monasteries and to other Christians. We know that multiple books were copied in different locations. We also know that when there were Viking raids on Lindisfarne and on Iona, that the books were some of the most important objects that were preserved and carried away and protected. So we know that these books had not only religious significance, but significance as education objects as well. And we also see that the limit here is not just on writing down the same words, but on embellishing those words in a way that is really meant as an act of prayer or devotion, as an act of glorifying God. And so the more that you look at this page, the more there is to see. If we get closer into the pattern, again, you can see why this artist has been nicknamed the Goldsmith. You can certainly see that intricate knotting going on there as well. Really just beautiful pattern. But the closer that we get, you can also see hidden symbols within them. There's a figure that reads like an angel here. This decorative area reads like a moth with wings. So the closer you get to it, the more there is to see. There's even hidden within it cat and mouse. So you can see this as sort of a combination of opposites, sort of an aggressor and a prey, predator and prey kind of relationship, but they also seem to be looking at a circular wafer. So the idea of host, perhaps the cats are protecting the host from being eaten by mice. There's also this idea of the sanctity of this object and the need to protect it is there as well. One of my favorite elements, though, is at the end of the letter that looks like a P in our row, Chiat row, we have a head and sort of hidden human portrait within there. So if I back up, just glancing at the page at first, you may not see that, but here's the head. There's our cat and mouse motif. Angels here, but the one we looked at is here. And the moth form is there. So the closer you get, the more there is really to see, the more there is to understand in this object. Our third artist after the portrait painter and the goldsmith is known as the illustrator. So you can see that there definitely is a little bit of a difference in the style and the way these two are working. This artist is responsible for this image, the arrest of Christ, and also the temptation page. Here's the temptation scene. So you can kind of see how each of those artists is slightly different in their approach to this material. Likely the same artist working here on the Evangelist page. More likely our Goldsmith here with the Gospel of John, but it's kind of fun to debate who is responsible for which page. You can see a continuity really between the kind of metalwork that is popular throughout the early Middle Ages in the work in the Scriptoria, certainly in the Illuminated Manuscripts, and now here into what are known as the high crosses. These are the closest things that we have to true monumental sculpture, and they function in odd ways. don't initially read as sculptural forms to us outright if you're thinking of sculpture as a freestanding depiction of a human being. If you think of sculpture as a monumental, three-dimensional carved form, then obviously they function that way. It would be easy to mistake this as being merely a religious symbol to denote that this is a religious space, but in fact that's one of their primary functions. The high crosses are very three-dimensional. They're not really all that flat. There's carving often on all four sides and quite deep, as you can see in this shot. The light is hitting it in the proper way to show you how deep the carving really is. And of course the interlace is very much part of this tradition. The perhaps most interesting and the one to really know for the test is a truly massive piece of sculpture. It's 18 feet in height. This is the High Cross of Mirdach from Monasterbos in Ireland. And so it is a multi-purpose object. It is reminding us that this is the exterior territory of a church. It's a focal point for people's gathering, not only for religious purposes, but to kind of serve as a reminder to avoid violence within the district marked off by the cross, but also as a focal point for civic life. This would be a gathering point probably for bringing people to market and to engage in secular activity as well. But you can see that there's figurative carving in addition to pattern work here. And so the main patterns or main visual images that are depicted are on the west side and the east side, the flat sections of the cross, as opposed to the edges or sides. So on the west side, you see the crucifixion scene. On the east side is the risen Christ, in fact, Christ in judgment. And if we zoom in on that section, you can see Christ's return. You can see souls lining up for judgment. You can also see just below Christ's feet the figure of the Archangel Michael weighing the souls. And that is very much a prevalent image throughout the Middle Ages. We're going to see a lot of that subject coming up in the artwork in France. So turning our attention now to Viking culture. So the Scandinavian warlords, the Vikings, who were the kings of the sea. They were able to create settlements as far away as Iceland and Greenland and even all the way to North America. So a really remarkable culture. The Viking culture, probably the most striking example that I can give you from artwork, also comes to us like the Sutton Hoo objects from a burial site. And this was discovered also in the 20th century. It is a remarkable 70-foot long, at its widest 15-foot wide Viking longship, which was used as a burial site. It had to be moved from a river inland in order to be buried. Within it were found two female figures, probably a queen or a tribal chieftain's wife and her servant, but then also various animals that were sacrificed for them as they passed into the afterlife. And included in the burial are other objects as well, including things that would help them in various terrain in the afterlife. There's a cart and there's even sledges or sleds for moving across frozen tundra or across snow. So the most striking aspect probably of the ship, other than just the really beautiful curves of the object itself, which are not only functional but are artistic and beautiful, is the carving along this bridge and into the finishing on both the fore and aft sections. And so what you're seeing here is a continuation of that incredible interlace. These are actually animal forms, very abstracted and rather deeply carved. There's also wooden animal posts. So these are finished not in the spiral that you see here, but finished to look like animals. They look a bit like lions to me, or dragons. This is by far the most famous of the five, and you can see here that the surface of the face has that interlace as well as this textured pattern. So an interesting combination of animal form with abstracted pattern idea. These are the carvings on the cart itself. You can see again that the patterns interlace with one another. We also know a fair amount about Viking culture from their language. And so what may at first seem to be just kind of random slash marks in this stone are in fact the runes, which we know equate to sounds that we associate with letters. So the Viking alphabet actually evolved over time, but began with these symbols that you see here, and they're primarily vertical and horizontal strokes. So a really fairly simple pictographic image that you can then begin to, once you understand which symbol corresponds to which letter, you can begin to pick apart the language. Probably the most remarkable of the objects that the Vikings have left us art-wise are carved stones, which we also know would have been pretty heavily painted. So the carving is not quite as deep on the stone as it can be on wood, but the paint is also something that helps to bring the image out. So these are the yelling stones. They are pretty important objects in terms of being able to read them for the runes, but also for the pictographic images. So the carving is a little bit more shallow on these than on the wood, so you do have to see them under the right lighting or see reproductions that then are painted. So the stones in this case are raised in honor of chieftains or kings. So the first stone is in honor of the king's wife, and the second larger stone was raised by his son, who then was taking credit for converting people to Christianity. So you can see that the influence of Christian religion and combined with this interlaced artistic technique is prevalent throughout the Hiberno-Saxon and Viking cultures. This is what the painting of this lion-like animal being attacked by a serpent should look like. But by far the most impressive aspect is this. This is King Harold reminding us that he is honoring both of his parents, the king who had raised the stone to his wife, but also giving honor to himself, and he is reminding us that he is responsible for making the Danish people convert to Christianity through this image, which in fact is the crucified Christ. Although you don't really see the cross, you clearly see vertical in the figure, halo with a cross in it, and then the arms outstretched in that cruciform pattern. This is probably the color palette that it would have had. This is the reproduction in the museum right next to the actual object itself. We also know that the Vikings constructed churches, and their church design is really pretty intricate. These are known as stave churches because of the use of vertical planks of wood called staves. And those staves are often very, very heavily ornamented. The staves are the vertical pieces, which can be carved as you see here. This is a reconstructed church, but this is the original stave carving, just astonishing in its level of creativity and intricate line work.